In late 2000, Mike Williams vanished during what should have been a simple duck hunting trip. His boat turned up, his gear was found. But Mike? Gone without a trace. What seemed like a tragic accident soon unraveled into a chilling mystery, filled with deception, betrayal, and murder. Was it nature's doing, or a calculated crime hiding in plain sight? Before we start, please comment down below where you are watching from, and what time is there right now. I will keep the screen dark so there is no light coming if you are trying to sleep. Let's get to it. Mike Williams seemed to have everything anyone could want. At just 31 years old, he had built a stable and successful life in Tallahassee, Florida. He was a rising star in real estate appraisal, working his way up the ladder through hard work and precision. His colleagues respected him, and his reputation for being both kind and driven made him someone people gravitated toward. In his personal life, Mike was equally accomplished. He had married his high school sweetheart, Denise, and together they appeared to have a happy and loving partnership. The two had a 6-month-old daughter at home, and Mike was known as a devoted father who doted on his little girl. Family and friends described him as reliable, hard-working, and deeply committed to the people he cared about. Life seemed to be progressing exactly the way Mike had planned it. One of Mike's passions, outside of his work and family, was duck hunting. It was a hobby he had cherished since his teenage years, a pursuit that allowed him some peace and escape from the demands of daily life. Over the years, he became an experienced outdoorsman, skilled at navigating the wetlands and waterways around North Florida. Hunting trips on crisp early mornings were a trusted ritual, not to mention something he loved doing alone. For Mike, these excursions weren't just a hobby, they were a time to unwind, reflect, and immerse himself in the calming rhythm of nature. December 16, 2000, was supposed to be one of those mornings. As usual, Mike had planned a solo outing to Lake Seminole, an area he knew well. The reservoir, straddling the Florida-Georgia border, was a popular spot for hunters. Its sprawling, swamp-like terrain made it rich in wildlife, but also challenging to navigate for anyone unfamiliar with its vastness. It wasn't Mike's first trip to the lake, and it likely wouldn't have been his last. Denise later told investigators that Mike had planned to be home by noon so they could celebrate their 6th wedding anniversary. That Saturday would mark more than half a decade of marriage, a milestone worth celebrating. But Mike never came home. By the time Denise realized something was wrong, it was already late afternoon. Frantic, she called her father, who then contacted a close family friend, Brian Winchester. Together, they began searching for Mike, eventually involving law enforcement once initial efforts proved unsuccessful. The first clue surfaced when his Ford Bronco was found parked near the lake, an ordinary sight for someone preparing to head out on the water. However, what became increasingly strange was that there wasn't any sign of Mike himself. The search expanded rapidly. Investigators deployed divers, boats, and specialized search equipment to comb Lake Seminole in hopes of locating either Mike or signs of what may have happened to him. Hours turned into days, and still, the search came up empty. On December 20, after nearly a week of intensive efforts, officials recovered Mike's hunting boat bobbing on the water. It appeared undamaged. Inside, they found a handful of his personal belongings, a shotgun, some decoys, and his beloved waders, the heavy, waterproof overalls duck hunters often wear. At first glance, the scene suggested a tragic but potentially simple explanation. The prevailing theory was that Mike had fallen overboard, weighed down by his gear, and drowned. Duck hunting is not without its risks, and Lake Seminole is known for its strong vegetation and difficult to navigate conditions. Accidents happen, even to skilled hunters. In December, when water temperatures are low, hypothermia can quickly set in for anyone submerged for too long. For authorities, the idea of an accidental drowning made sense. Extensive debris and dense grasses could have concealed his body, making recovery more difficult. Moreover, the lake was home to several large alligators, another factor officials thought could explain why no trace of Mike had yet been found. However, doubts began to creep in as the days stretched into weeks without answers. Even in lakes as expansive as Seminole, human remains are almost always recovered during a search of this magnitude. Specialists in water rescues noted that bodies in freshwater environments tend to float to the surface within days due to natural buoyancy. Yet there was nothing, no new signs of Mike, no physical evidence to suggest what had actually happened. Lending to the growing unease was the level of effort being poured into the search. By all accounts, the response to Mike's disappearance was exhaustive. Teams of trained divers methodically searched underwater areas known to trap debris or obstruct visibility. Helicopters and boats with sonar technology scanned wide stretches of the lake from above and below. Volunteer rescue squads covered shorelines, combing through marshes and overgrowth inch by inch. Friends and family members of Mike watched helplessly from the sidelines, frustrated as each day passed without progress. People who had lived in the area for decades commented on how rare it was for a body to not be recovered under such circumstances. "That lake gives up its dead," one searcher reportedly said at the time. This lack of resolution struck an unusual chord with Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. Cheryl never accepted the idea that her son's death was simply a hunting accident gone awry. To her, the Mike she knew, a careful, responsible man, wouldn't have made a mistake that cost him his life. He was meticulous by nature, someone who valued planning and preparation. He always wore his life jacket when he hunted, and he knew the waters of Lake Seminole well enough to avoid common hazards. To Cheryl, the narrative that Mike had drowned and been consumed by alligators felt more like a convenient explanation than the actual truth. Other elements of the case also didn't sit right. Mike was known to be a strong swimmer, someone who could handle himself in the water even under difficult conditions. His waders, though cumbersome, weren't torn or damaged when found, something one would expect if they had been dislodged while he struggled in the lake. More importantly, why hadn't his body surfaced? Forensic experts had pointed out during the investigation that alligator activity in December was typically minimal. The reptiles are cold-blooded, which means they tend to slow down in cooler weather, entering periods of low activity that make it unlikely they would aggressively feed or attack. So questions began piling up, and answers remained elusive. While many in the community leaned toward believing Mike's death was simply an unfortunate accident, doubts continued to simmer just beneath the surface. The combination of incomplete evidence, unusual circumstances, and Cheryl's growing insistence that something wasn't right left law enforcement with a mystery they couldn't fully resolve. The case remained stagnant, filled with speculation, but largely without any definitive proof to suggest foul play or exonerate it. By the time 2001 rolled around, both the official investigation and the volunteer search efforts began to wind down. With Mike still missing, authorities had little choice but to treat his disappearance as an accidental drowning. There was no body to rule otherwise, and without a witness or a confession, their hands were tied. Denise, left grieving the loss of her husband, made moves to settle his affairs and work toward a semblance of normalcy for their child. Friends and loved ones expressed sympathy, doing what they could to support her during what appeared to be a tragic chapter in her life. But in the quiet weeks and months that followed, more whispers of doubt circulated. Could there have been something sinister lurking behind the narrative of an accident? Cheryl Williams certainly thought so, and her quest to uncover the truth was just beginning. The question remained, how could a man like Mike Williams, in the prime of his life, vanish completely without leaving a shred of hard evidence behind? At this point, it seemed the story of Mike's life ended on Lake Seminole. Yet, someone, somewhere, likely knew exactly what had happened that day. The theory that alligators might have consumed Mike Williams's body emerged early in the investigation, becoming one of the primary explanations for why no remains were recovered from Lake Seminole. For investigators, it seemed like a plausible scenario at first. Lake Seminole is a sprawling reservoir on the Florida-Georgia border, known for its murky water, dense vegetation, and abundant wildlife, including its population of alligators. When Mike's truck and boat were found but his body was not, the idea that the lake's predators had played a role fit well with the initial narrative of an accidental drowning. It was a neat explanation, wrapping a complex situation into something easily understood. A man fell into the water, drowned, and then disappeared into the ecosystem. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FFWCC, officials focused their early efforts on recovering what they could from the lake. But after weeks of intense searching, hope began to fade, and speculation about the role of alligators became louder. A private search firm even floated the suggestion that alligators could have dismembered and stored portions of Mike's body underwater, a macabre survival behavior sometimes observed in alligator feeding patterns. Without tangible answers, this theory gained traction among law enforcement and the public alike. It seemed to explain why the lake had given up none of Mike's remains, no clothing fragments, no hard tissue, no signs he had ever been there, aside from his abandoned boat. At first, this explanation felt comforting to some. Alligators, after all, were an ever-present danger in Florida's waterways, and the water around Lake Seminole was no exception. Many residents in the area, accustomed to the creature's presence, found the theory reasonable. But as experts began to weigh in, cracks in the idea quickly emerged. Cold weather ended up being one of the most glaring inconsistencies. Herpetologist Matt Oresco, who had studied alligator behavior extensively, pointed out that alligators are cold-blooded animals, meaning their activity slows significantly in colder temperatures. During the winter months, particularly when water temperatures drop below 55 degrees F, alligators reduce their movements and cease hunting. At the time of Mike's disappearance, daytime temperatures hovered around 55 degrees Celsius, with overnight lows dropping into the freezing range. The lake's waters were recorded at around 46 degrees F, well within the range that makes alligators sluggish, dormant, and uninterested in feeding. Oresco's conclusions challenged the core of the alligator theory directly. For alligators to have swarmed and entirely consumed a human body in these conditions would have been extraordinarily rare, virtually unheard of, in fact. Feeding under these circumstances would go against their typical winter habits, when survival depends more on conserving energy than on the active pursuit of food. To put it simply, it was hard to envision the slow-moving reptiles aggressively devouring Mike Williams in the cold December waters of Lake Seminole. The condition of the items recovered from the lake also added to the growing skepticism. Approximately 6 months after his disappearance, searchers found Mike's waders, a hunting jacket, and a flashlight. For a case that many assumed involved alligators, these items told a conflicting story. A forensic examination of the waders revealed no tears, punctures, or bite marks, evidence that would almost certainly be present if large predators had attacked someone wearing them. What's more, the flashlight was still functional when turned on, and both the jacket and waders showed fewer signs of decomposition than expected for objects submerged for half a year. These findings cast doubt on whether Mike's body, or any part of it, had been exposed to the natural forces thought to have caused his disappearance. Compounding the doubts was a small but significant detail about Mike's habits on the water. A close friend who frequently hunted with Mike told investigators that Mike took safety seriously, to the point where he followed a meticulous routine every time he set out. For instance, he would never wear his waders while driving his boat. Experienced duck hunters like Mike knew that wearing waders in a moving boat could be dangerous. If someone were to fall overboard, the waterlogged material could drag them down or restrict their movement. Mike, being cautious by nature, avoided that risk. So why then would his waders have turned up in the investigation? If Mike wasn't prone to unnecessary risks, why would he have changed his routine on that particular day? These small but significant details painted a picture that didn't align with the alligator theory or even the accidental drowning explanation more broadly. One by one, the assumptions that had built up around Mike's disappearance started to fall apart. The cold water, the condition of recovered items, and Mike's well-known habits all suggested that something else entirely might have happened. For Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, these inconsistencies validated her doubts. She had never believed that alligators had consumed her son or that he had drowned at all. To her, the unwillingness to challenge this theory signaled something more concerning, an effort to close the case too quickly without asking the right questions. If alligators weren't involved, then what had kept a body from being recovered? Why hadn't Mike's remains surfaced when, in most freshwater cases, natural buoyancy brings victims back to the surface within a matter of days? Why did his equipment seem so undisturbed, as though it had been placed, not lost? If Lake Seminole wasn't hiding the answers, might the truth lie somewhere else entirely? By mid-2001, the narrative was shifting. The alligator theory had been weakened to the point where it no longer carried much weight in the investigation. Among experts and skeptics alike, a new question emerged. Had someone used the lake itself as a cover? At first glance, Mike Williams' disappearance might have looked like an accident. But now, it seemed less and less like a tragic mistake and more like a deliberate act. Authorities began to wrestle with possibilities they hadn't initially considered. Could the lake have been staged as part of a larger plan? And if so, who would have had the motive and the opportunity to make Mike Williams vanish? The details surrounding Mike Williams' disappearance just didn't add up. A boat with its engine turned off, a full gas tank, and unscathed hunting gear shouldn't have been part of a drowning narrative knot if the accident unfolded the way investigators initially theorized. But these were exactly the conditions of Mike's belongings when they were found. Each piece of evidence raised new questions, piecing together an unusual and unsettling picture. Let's go back to where it all began. Mike's boat, discovered 4 days after he vanished, roughly 225 feet from the nearest boat ramp. It appeared eerily intact. The engine wasn't idling or even damage at it was completely off. According to the initial theory, Mike had supposedly fallen out after colliding with one of Lake Seminole's many partially submerged tree stumps, which are known hazards for boaters in the area. But there was one glaring problem with this explanation. A representative from the boat manufacturer later confirmed that if Mike had fallen out while the engine was on, it would have continued running, causing the boat to circle aimlessly until the fuel ran out. Instead, the gas tank was full, as though the boat hadn't been in use at all. Why was the engine off? And why did it look like the boat had been deliberately anchored in place? Even its location didn't make sense. At the time of Mike's disappearance, weather in the area included strong westerly winds caused by a storm that swept through. If the boat had been left unmoored and floating, those winds should have pushed it eastward toward the Georgia side of the lake. Instead, it remained close to the Florida boat ramp, where Mike's truck and trailer had been parked. It was as if the boat hadn't drifted much at all, challenging the idea that it had been floating freely after a random accident. Was it simply an anomaly? Or could it suggest the boat was intentionally staged to sell the appearance of an accident? Inside the boat, investigators found more puzzling clues. Mike's shotgun, carefully stored in its case, was lying undisturbed. Duck hunters take their shotguns out as soon as they're out on the water, prepared to hunt at a moment's notice, especially at prime times of day. Mike was a meticulous, experienced outdoorsman. Carrying a cased shotgun while already on the lake wasn't his routine. His hunting license and boyhood experience in these very waters meant he didn't leave things to chance, especially with gear essential to his trips. If Mike had planned to start hunting that morning, why was the shotgun still secured? The condition of Mike's belongings, found months later, added even more questions. The waders were one of the standout discoveries. Heavy and cumbersome, waders are specifically designed to protect the legs and lower body from water, and they're a staple for duck hunters. These were found undamaged and remarkably pristine, showing no signs of having been submerged and decayed in the dark, muddy depths of the lake for 6 months. In fact, they floated on the surface when finally discovered a sharp contradiction to the initial drowning theory. A forensic analysis confirmed there were no tears, punctures, or deterioration that might indicate exposure to rough waters, debris, or predators. Then there was the flashlight. Recovered with the other items, it was still functional when investigators switched it on. The light came back to life with a simple twist of the switch, totally at odds with the idea that it had spent months under layers of sediment and aquatic plant life. Batteries corrode quickly in humid, submerged conditions, but this one seemed untouched by its supposed ordeal. That single beam of working light contradicted the official claims of long-term immersion. Equally dubious was Mike's hunting jacket, which exhibited minimal signs of environmental wear or decay. Together, the condition of the recovered gear signaled something investigators couldn't ignore. These items may not have been lost during an accident at all. Were they ever submerged for months, or were they strategically placed in the lake long after Mike vanished? Mike's personal habits only deepened the mystery. Witnesses who had hunted with Mike over the years described him as extremely cautious, almost methodical in his approach to water safety. This was not a man prone to risks. One notable habit stood out. Mike refused to wear his waders while driving his boat. The added weight, combined with their restrictive fit, made falling into the water while wearing them a near-certain death sentence. Instead, Mike always waited to put them on after the boat was docked or anchored, once he was prepared to begin hunting. So why would he have been wearing them on the boat that day, as officials implied? This single detail ran counter to everything Mike's friends knew about his personality and habits. It was hard to reconcile this particular point with the accident theory. If Mike was always this careful, how could something as dangerous and preventable as falling into the water with waders have happened to him? Then there was the troubling issue of where Mike had launched his boat. His truck was discovered parked near a simple, undeveloped launch site here, far cry from the polished concrete ramps he preferred. Mike liked efficiency and ease, and he generally avoided the rougher areas, the ones that required extra effort to get his boat in and out of the water. This choice of launch stood out as uncharacteristic. Why would Mike use a less finished area he rarely turned to for his routine outings? More importantly, did Mike even launch the boat from this ramp at all, or had his truck been parked there by someone else to throw off investigators? The discovery of Mike's items and boat reopened critical questions with each passing development. Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, grew more vocal in her disbelief of the official reasoning. Even while the file labeled Mike's case a tragic accident, she refused to accept it. To her, the inconsistencies surrounding the evidence painted a different picture, one that investigators still hadn't fully acknowledged, and as details came to light, other red flags began to rise. One of the most damning problems of the investigation was its handling in the early hours and days after Mike's disappearance. Investigators failed to secure the boat as a potential crime scene. It was soon returned to Mike's family, as though there were no need to preserve it for further examination. The same occurred with his truck. The area surrounding the boat ramp was never treated as a proper investigative site. In addition, the storm that rolled through after Mike vanished brought dozens of volunteers and curious onlookers to the scene. As efforts to find Mike intensified, the crowds inadvertently compromised any chance of collecting reliable forensic evidence from the area. These accumulated details began to gnaw at anyone paying close attention to the case. Mike's pristine waders, the floating boat with a full gas tank and an engine switched off it was all too strange to accept without more critical analysis. The unsecured scene made it difficult to know whether the original clues even reflected the truth of what had happened that day. It no longer felt like the lake was the only thing keeping the mystery of Mike Williams from being solved. It was starting to feel like someone had gone to great lengths to ensure questions outnumbered answers. With no body and no solid explanation, what had first looked like a tragic accident was starting to feel completely different. If Mike hadn't drowned accidentally in Lake Seminole, then what did happen? And if someone staged the boat, the gear, or even the truck, why would they go to such trouble? Each of these discrepancies brought the investigation one step closer to a possibility more chilling than any alligator-infested marsh. What if Mike Williams' disappearance hadn't been an accident at all? What if someone had planned this? As unsettling as these questions were, more disturbing answers began to surface. Investigators and those closest to Mike started to see threads pointing away from Lake Seminole and toward Mike's personal life, a life that, beneath the surface, wasn't as picture-perfect as it seemed. Denise Williams appears, at first glance, to be a grieving widow. Her husband, Mike, had disappeared under tragic and mysterious circumstances, leaving Denise behind to raise their 6-month-old daughter alone. And for a time, the tragedy seemed to fit neatly into place: a tragic drowning on a cold December morning, an unfortunate accident that left a hole in the lives of his loved ones. But just beneath the surface, there were details about Denise's life that would soon raise questions. Questions about her relationships, questions about money, and, eventually, questions about whether Mike's disappearance was an accidenta, something much darker. Not long after Mike's disappearance, one specific piece of information came to light that started to change how some people viewed Denise's role in the case. In the months leading up to Mike's disappearance, Brian Winchester, a family friend, had facilitated the purchase of a substantial life insurance policy on Mike. This was a significant policy, with a payout of $1 million, an amount large enough to support a surviving family after an unexpected tragedy. On the surface, this kind of planning wasn't unusual. Mike was a responsible man, a careful planner who prioritized his family's financial well-being. It wasn't hard to believe that he would take steps to ensure Denise and their baby would be protected if something happened to him. But as more details about the insurance policy emerged, its timing and circumstances caught the attention of investigators. Brian Winchester wasn't just a casual acquaintance of the Williams family, he was deeply intertwined in their lives. The two men had been close friends for years, part of a small, tight-knit group of friends and family that often socialized together. Brian had been trusted enough to handle the life insurance arrangements, which made sense given that he worked in the financial services industry. He appeared to be someone Mike relied on, a friend who could be counted on to help navigate the sometimes complicated details of life insurance policies. But what didn't make sense, at least not to Cheryl Williams and eventually to investigators, was just how quickly things seemed to fall into place for Brian and Denise after Mike's disappearance. In the years that followed, the friendship between Denise and Brian began evolving into something more. In 2005, just 5 years after Mike had vanished, the two married. For many, this raised eyebrows. Cheryl Williams, in particular, viewed the relationship between Denise and Brian with suspicion. She had already been outspoken in her belief that Mike's death was not an accident, and the timing of this new marriage only deepened her doubts. Denise and Brian, now living together as a married couple, continued to raise Mike and Denise's daughter in the same house where Denise had lived with Mike. It was a blending of lives that, to some, appeared far too convenient. Adding to Cheryl's suspicions was the financial windfall that Denise had received following Mike's disappearance. After her husband was declared legally dead, Denise had collected the full $1 million life insurance payout. This payout, coupled with her remarriage to Brian, raised questions among those already uneasy about the circumstances of Mike's disappearance. Cheryl frequently pointed out that Denise's financial stability and apparent ability to move forward with her life stood in sharp contrast to the devastation many expected from a grieving widow. To Cheryl, it felt like Denise and Brian had not just accepted Mike's death but had benefited from it in ways that were difficult to ignore. For investigators, the connection between the life insurance payout and Denise's remarriage to Brian prompted closer scrutiny. They began to revisit the details surrounding the policy itself, focusing on its timing and the role Brian had played in setting it up. Taking out life insurance isn't uncommon, but what stood out in this case was how recently the policy had been purchased before Mike's disappearance. Brian Winchester had played an active role in encouraging Mike and Denise to secure the policy. His expertise in financial planning often meant friends and family trusted his advice on these matters. But had this specific policy been too conveniently timed? For Cheryl Williams, the connections felt almost too calculated to be coincidence. She pointed to the insurance payout, the new marriage, and Brian's central role in both as evidence that her son's disappearance was no accident. In her mind, there were clear motives for foul play. Mike was the obstacle, and his death had cleared the way for both financial gain and a life together for Denise and Brian. Her relentless lobbying of law enforcement to reopen Mike's case became all the more intense as these suspicions bubbled to the surface. Still, authorities hesitated to act. The case remained cold for years after Mike was declared legally dead. Without a body or solid evidence of foul play, there wasn't much to prove that animosity or a crime existed. While the connection between Denise and Brian raised questions publicly, it wasn't enough to bring any official charges. The fact that someone benefited financially from a life insurance policy didn't automatically make them a suspect. In the eyes of the law, lifting suspicions to the level of definitive proof required more than public discomfort. The timeline of Denise and Brian's relationship, however, became increasingly difficult for investigators to overlook. Cheryl's persistence kept the case alive in the public sphere, and little by little, former acquaintances of the couple began to come forward with observations that suggested their connection had developed well before Mike's disappearance. Early hints of affection between the two reportedly existed within social circles prior to December, 2,000 details that added more fuel to Cheryl's belief that this wasn't simply two people leaning on each other during a shared loss. Were Denise and Brian romantically involved before Mike disappeared? If so, it added a new layer to the investigation surrounding Mike's supposed accident at Lake Seminole. In hindsight, Cheryl viewed her son's death as the starting point for Denise and Brian's life together. Although Denise was publicly quiet about Mike's death, Cheryl believed her actions spoke volumes. Cheryl often raised the question with investigators, how could someone move on so quickly, so smoothly, without a deeper reason? The financial windfall from that life insurance policy and the publicity that followed their eventual marriage put Denise and Brian in an uncomfortable spotlight. And while they attempted to portray a new life of normalcy, the whispers of those who knew them began to shift the tone of the narrative. Despite Cheryl's relentless efforts, law enforcement was slow to act. For years, the story of Mike's disappearance stayed frozen in place, untouched by new evidence or significant breakthroughs. Investigators knew something didn't align perfectly with an accidental drowning, but they lacked the hard evidence needed to fully pursue another line of inquiry. Denise and Brian's marriage fueled suspicion, but wasn't proof of any wrongdoing. The insurance payout seemed ill-timed, but, on its own, wasn't enough to unwind the complicated web of relationships. There were no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence, and no clear motive, at least in legal terms. What Cheryl didn't realize during those years of frustration and waiting was that the facade of Denise and Brian's life together was already beginning to crack. Behind closed doors, their relationship was far from the perfect partnership it appeared to be. Trouble between the two would eventually lead to desperate actions on Brian Winchester's part that, years later, would break open the case and shed light on the truth behind Mike Williams' disappearance. By the early 2000s, Cheryl could feel momentum building, even if progress felt slow. Over time, public pressure began to mount, and with each media appearance Cheryl made, she refused to let her son's story fade from memory. Her accusations against Brian and Denise grew sharper, louder, and more pointed as she became convinced Mike had met with foul play. Authorities eventually reopened the case in 2004, largely due to Cheryl's tireless advocacy. But as investigators took a second look, they would come to see just how tangled the story of Denise, Brian, and Mike really was. And while this chapter of the case focused on the beginnings of suspicion, the truth was only just starting to surface. It would take years and an act of desperation by Brian Winchester before the full scope of what happened to Mike Williams came to light. Cheryl Williams couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. From the moment she heard the explanation of her son's disappearance, a presumed drowning accident in the murky waters of Lake Seminole, was unconvinced. The idea that Mike, a cautious outdoorsman and strong swimmer, could slip beneath the surface without a trace and somehow not resurface never sat right with her. Then there was the fact that experienced searchers, equipped with sonar and dive teams, hadn't found a single piece of conclusive evidence to support a drowning. For Cheryl, the lack of answers wasn't evidence that Mike's death was an accident. It was evidence that something was being missed or hidden. While others moved on, Cheryl refused to let the matter rest. What followed was a years-long campaign, fueled by a mother's intuition and an unrelenting desire to know the truth. Cheryl's fight for answers began in 2000, in the immediate aftermath of Mike's disappearance. At first, like anyone in her position, she hoped for a quick resolution, but as days turned into weeks and still no body was recovered, her hope turned to frustration. The lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in the theories, and the neatly tied-up conclusion of an accidental drowning felt premature, worse, wrong. With few allies and even fewer resources, Cheryl launched her own efforts to uncover what had really happened to her son. She began reaching out to local authorities, questioning every detail she could about the investigation. She wanted to know why the search had turned up empty and why law enforcement seemed so willing to close the case after only a few weeks of searching. Her questions often fell on deaf ears. Cheryl was met with resistance, sometimes outright dismissal from the agencies involved in the early stages of the investigation. One problem, it seemed, was the lack of clear-cut evidence pointing to foul play. Without a crime scene, a motive, or even a body, law enforcement saw no justification to treat Mike's disappearance as anything but a tragic accident. Cheryl's concerns were often brushed aside, and she found herself fighting not just to prove her point but to have it heard at all. Faced with official indifference, Cheryl decided to take matters into her own hands. She turned to her community, hoping to keep Mike's case in the public eye. Cheryl used local newspapers to her advantage, purchasing ads that asked for information and encouraged anyone with knowledge of the disappearance to come forward. She was strategic, knowing that the more attention she could draw to her son's story, the harder it would be for authorities to ignore. Billboards soon went up near high-traffic areas, reminding everyone in the region that Mike Williams was still missing and that his mother wasn't giving up. In Cheryl's mind, forgetting was not an option. But Cheryl didn't stop with public appeals. She also approached state officials, writing letters to explain her concerns and demand further action. Her persistence was staggering. She reportedly wrote a letter to Florida Governor Rick Scott every single day for months, asking him to assign the case to another agency or appoint a special prosecutor. In total, she sent more than 200 letters, yet they went unanswered. The silence from top officials only fueled Cheryl's anger. She believed the system was failing her son, and she was determined to make sure that wouldn't happen. By 2004, these efforts finally started to make a dent. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, agreed to revisit the case nearly 4 years after Mike disappeared. For Cheryl, this small breakthrough was proof that persistence worked. But getting the case reopened was just one step. The real battle would be whether anyone could find the evidence to crack it open. Cheryl continued to push, refusing to let momentum stall. She kept speaking out, emphasizing the inconsistencies in Mike's case, and making it clear she had no plans to quit until she had answers. Throughout this time, Cheryl faced significant challenges. Her unwavering belief that Mike had not drowned wasn't always met with sympathy or support. Friends, neighbors, and even some family members began to question why she couldn't let go. People criticized her for holding on to what they saw as false hope, insisting that Mike's death was simply a tragedy, not a mystery. But Cheryl didn't back down. She famously told reporters in 2007, "I get criticized a lot for not admitting that Mike's dead. All I know is I can't stop looking for him until I find him." To her, the unanswered questions weren't just an obstacle, they were a sign that someone wasn't telling the truth. Cheryl's determination extended to the media as well. In 2012, Mike's story was featured on an episode of Disappeared, a popular true crime series on investigation discovery. Cheryl played a key role in ensuring the show featured the case, knowing that national attention could apply a fresh kind of pressure to those involved. The episode brought Mike's story to a wider audience, renewing interest in the bizarre circumstances of his disappearance. In every interview she gave about the case, Cheryl reiterated her belief that her son had not drowned. She never hesitated to criticize law enforcement for their lack of action and slow response in the early days of the investigation. Her persistence made sure the case remained active in the public's mind and impossible for officials to completely ignore. Behind the scenes, Cheryl continued to explore every lead she could. She engaged with anyone she thought might have information, no matter how small. People from Mike's past, strangers in Tallahassee's tight-knit community. Anyone who crossed Cheryl's path might find themselves drawn into her search for the truth. Sometimes the trail led to dead ends, but Cheryl was undeterred. What kept her going, she often said, was her love for her son. She couldn't accept a life where there wasn't justice for Mikey or worse, a life where the truth never surfaced at all. While Cheryl's efforts focused on keeping the investigation alive, she couldn't ignore the other strange developments happening around her. Denise Williams and Brian Winchester's marriage in 2005 hadn't gone unnoticed. Cheryl had publicly expressed her suspicions about the life insurance policy and its potentially suspicious timing, but now she found herself raising questions about Denise and Brian's personal lives too. To Cheryl, the marriage was more than just a coincidence, it was a motive. She believed that Mike's death might have paved the way for Denise and Brian's life together, along with the financial security Denise gained through the insurance payout. Cheryl didn't shy away from implying that the couple knew far more about Mike's disappearance than they'd ever admitted. Still, for years, her suspicions didn't move the needle far enough to shift the investigation forward. The FDLE's re-examination of the case in 2004 didn't result in any arrests or new evidence being found. But crucially, it did keep the focus from fading entirely. Cheryl's persistence acted as a safeguard, ensuring that Mike's case wasn't relegated to a forgotten file in some corner of law enforcement archives. It may not have provided immediate answers, but it kept attention on the oddities and contradictions that surrounded Mike's disappearance. This would prove critical in later years when new evidence finally came to light. Cheryl's dedication stands out not only because of what she achieved, but also because of how long it took. The fight for justice spanned more than a decade. And at every turn, Cheryl encountered obstacles that might have caused anyone else to stop. But quitting was never an option. For Cheryl, advocating for her son wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about giving him the dignity he deserved, even in death. What Cheryl couldn't know at the time was that the answers she'd sought for so long were closer than anyone realized. Behind closed doors, cracks were forming in Denise and Brian's relationship. Those cracks would widen over the years, ultimately leading to a series of events that, quite unexpectedly, provided the break the case had been waiting for. Cheryl's tireless fight had kept the investigation alive long enough for those cracks to appear. The stage was set for a confession that would finally confirm what Cheryl had suspected all along. Mike's death wasn't an accident. It was a murder. In August 2016, the disappearance of Mike Williams, which had baffled investigators and haunted his mother Cheryl for 16 years, took an unexpected turn. Brian Winchester, the man who had married Mike's widow, Denise, was arrested not for anything directly related to Mike, but for a crime no one had seen coming. Winchester had kidnapped Denise at gunpoint. The details were startling. On her way to work at Florida State University that morning, Denise found Brian waiting for her. Armed and agitated, he climbed into her car and held her hostage. It was a brazen and desperate act, one that puzzled even those close to the case. But while the kidnapping itself seemed unrelated to Mike's disappearance, it soon became the thread that would unravel years of secrets. At the time, Denise and Brian had been going through a contentious divorce. Their relationship, which had seemed deliberately built on the foundations of Mike's absence, had grown increasingly strained over the years. In court filings, Denise said she had feared Brian's behavior was becoming erratic. It wasn't just about their failing marriage, there were hints of paranoia and desperation in his actions, and when he kidnapped her, those fears were painfully validated. Authorities charged Brian with multiple crimes, including armed burglary, domestic assault, and kidnapping, all of which underscored the severity of the situation. Brian was held without bond, as both prosecutors and the courts deemed him a significant threat. For Denise, who sought immediate protection orders against him, the incident was terrifying. But for investigators, it was a bizarre opportunity. Brian's arrest gave law enforcement the opening they'd been waiting for. His erratic behavior during the kidnapping and the circumstances of his unraveling domestic life raised new questions about his past and his possible involvement in Mike Williams' disappearance. Brian was no longer just Denise's second husband or a once-trusted family friend. He was now a key figure under the microscope, someone whose story demanded to be revisited. The arrest came with one critical advantage: pressure. Facing decades in prison, Brian now had something to lose. And, after years of silence, investigators suspected he might be willing to talk not just about the kidnapping, but about what had happened to Mike back in 2000. Initially, Brian denied any involvement. His defense team downplayed any connection between the disappearance and his legal troubles, framing the kidnapping as a moment of poor judgment during an emotionally charged time. But behind the scenes, investigators weren't buying it. The timing of the life insurance payout, the quick marriage to Denise, and now this act of desperation, everything pointed to a deeper story Brian wasn't telling. By 2017, as Brian's legal battles over the kidnapping played out, negotiations quietly took shape. Authorities suspected Brian knew where Mike's body was, and they were determined to get it out of him. Around this time, prosecutors seemed willing to strike a deal. They couldn't erase the charges tied to the kidnapping, but they hinted at a lighter sentence in exchange for crucial information about Mike's disappearance. For Brian, this was a lifeline in an otherwise bleak reality. He began cooperating, and in early October of that year, he gave investigators the one thing they had been chasing for over a decade: the location of Mike Williams' body. The site Brian described was a muddy patch of land at the end of Gardner Road in northern Leon County, Florida. It was roughly 5 miles from where Mike had grown up, a place with haunting proximity to the life he had built and ultimately lost. In the weeks that followed, a team of county workers, search dogs, and investigators began excavating the area. They worked for 5 days, meticulously digging through the dense, wet soil to uncover exactly what Brian had described. Finally, after years of dead ends and false starts, there was a breakthrough. Human remains were recovered from the scene. They were sent for forensic testing, and not long after, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement confirmed the results. The remains belonged to Mike Williams. The confirmation marked the case's most significant development since Mike had disappeared 16 years earlier. DNA testing, matched against a sample provided by Cheryl Williams, left no doubt. Mike hadn't drowned in Lake Seminole. He hadn't been consumed by alligators or lost to the elements in a tragic accident. He had been murdered. The initial theories that had dogged the investigation for so long were now conclusively disproved. Cheryl Williams' years of fighting, lobbying, and pushing for answers had finally been validated. Her son had fallen victim to something far more sinister than anyone had imagined in those early days after his disappearance. What made the location even more haunting was its personal connection to Mike. The site where his body was buried was intimate and deliberate, hidden in plain sight yet close to home. It wasn't some remote swamp or anonymous burial ground. Instead, it was a pocket of land familiar to Brian Winchester. This wasn't a random act, investigators realized. It was calculated. It also spoke to the sheer audacity of whoever had left Mike there, possibly believing no one would ever look or suspect foul play. But now the body had been found, setting the stage for more revelations. The details weren't made public immediately, and this was a deliberate choice by investigators. The cause of death and specific evidence recovered from the site were kept confidential. The goal was to ensure that any forthcoming details, particularly those from potential suspects, would line up with facts only the involved parties could know. By controlling the flow of information, law enforcement positioned themselves to build a stronger case, one less vulnerable to misinterpretation or leaks. But for Cheryl and her supporters, the discovery of Mike's remains had already provided one critical piece of closure: confirmation that her instincts about her son's fate had been right all along. Brian's confession and Mike's discovery also reopened long-standing questions about Denise's role in everything that had transpired. For years, Cheryl had speculated about whether Denise was more involved than she let on. Would Brian's cooperation implicate Denise further? Investigators, already circling around her inconsistencies, now had more to work with. And as more details about Mike's murder emerged, Denise would soon find herself in the spotlight in ways she had fought to avoid. Ultimately, Brian's arrest for the kidnapping of Denise Williams became a turning point investigators had never anticipated. What began as the unraveling of a toxic, crumbling marriage revealed far more than Denise and Brian had likely ever intended. Mike Williams, who for years seemed like the victim of a tragic accident, was finally vindicated as the victim of a calculated crime. His remains, recovered and positively identified, told a story no one could ignore. But if Brian's confession confirmed one thing, it raised another unsettling question. What had really happened on Lake Seminole that day in December 2000? What role had Denise played, if any? And what motivations had turned a trusted best friend and a loving wife into suspects in a murder case? The discovery of Mike's body wasn't just a resolution, it was the start of a new phase in the investigation. Now, investigators had the proof they needed to begin asking harder questions. And as they turned to the circumstances of Mike's death, Brian's confession would reveal nearly unthinkable details about betrayal, deceit, and the length some people will go to for love, money, and a life free of obstacles. But for Cheryl, it was the moment she had been fighting for all along. Her son didn't drown. He didn't simply vanish. Someone had taken him, buried him, and stolen his life. The truth behind Mike Williams' disappearance was chilling. For years, his death had looked like a tragic accident. But in 2017, Brian Winchester revealed a story no one had imagined. It was a crime that had been set in motion months before that December morning, in 2000, carefully plotted and executed by two people Mike trusted most: his wife, Denise, and his best friend, Brian. The details, according to Brian's confession, exposed a murder wrapped in betrayal, greed, and manipulation. This was not an accident, it was a calculated plan to eliminate Mike and make his death look like one. It started, Brian claimed, as an idea born out of his and Denise's ongoing affair. The relationship between Denise and Brian hadn't been a fleeting lapse in judgment. It began in 1997, 3 years before Mike's disappearance, while both were still married to their respective spouses. Over time, the affair grew more serious. Brian testified that their initial plans were to leave their spouses, but the logistics seemed too complicated. They worried about how a divorce, particularly Denise's, might impact their lives. Denise, according to Brian, didn't want to deal with the financial fallout, custody issues, or the social consequences of ending her marriage to Mike. Their solution was as twisted as it was clear: get rid of Mike. The plot officially began in early 2000, 9 months before Mike's disappearance. Denise and Brian discussed several potential scenarios to make Mike's death look like an accident. The first plan involved a boating trip to the Gulf of Mexico, where Brian would stage a fatal mishap. But according to Brian, they ultimately abandoned this idea because it seemed too risky, too complicated. Instead, they shifted their focus to a hunting trip on Lake Seminole, a setting that gave them the advantage of isolation and plausible danger. They believed the lake would provide the perfect cover if Mike drowned. No one would question it. The story would write itself. On the morning of December 16, 2000, Brian put the plan into motion. He convinced Mike to go duck hunting at Lake Seminole, just as they had done many times before. To Mike, it was another routine outing, but to Brian, it was the culmination of months of preparation and deceit. The two friends launched the boat into the water just before dawn, under the pretense of looking for prime hunting spots. As they moved further out into the lake, Brian urged Mike to put on his waders, a decision that would later prove significant. Brian's account of what happened next revealed a sequence of events that would alter lives forever. As they reached a secluded area of the lake, Brian deliberately pushed Mike out of the boat. The cold, murky water immediately swallowed Mike, and his heavy waders made it almost impossible for him to tread water. But despite the plan's careful design, Mike didn't immediately drown. He managed to grab onto a nearby tree stump, holding himself above water and fighting to survive. At this point, the facade of accident began to fall apart. What was supposed to be a quick and undetectable death turned into something much messier. As Mike clung to the stump, Brian realized he had no other option but to finish what he'd started. He retrieved his shotgun, stepped closer to the edge of the boat, and fired a single shot. The blast hit Mike in the face, killing him instantly. The betrayal Mike must have felt in those final moments, looking up at the person he'd once considered a lifelong friend, was unimaginable. Brian's confession left little doubt about the deliberate and calculated nature of this act. There was no hesitation in his account. What followed only underscored the lengths he and Denise were willing to go to cover their tracks. After killing Mike, Brian transported his body back to shore. He had already chosen a site to dispose of a muddy area near Gardner Road, relatively close to where Mike had grown up. There, Brian buried Mike's remains in a shallow grave, covering them with debris to make the spot as inconspicuous as possible. The next step in the plan was just as unsettling as the murder itself, going back to their everyday lives as if nothing had happened. For Denise and Brian, the goal wasn't just to avoid suspicion, it was to erase Mike entirely. That same evening, Brian attended a family Christmas party as planned. He arrived on time, acted normal, and avoided behaviors that might raise questions. Denise, back at home with their infant daughter, played her role as the concerned wife without hesitation. For a time, the plan appeared to work. Investigators initially treated Mike's disappearance as an accident, and within weeks, Denise began the process of cashing in on the 1 million life insurance policy that Brian had helped her secure. The depth of their betrayal went far beyond the murder itself. For Mike, the plot was carried out by the two people he trusted above all else. Denise was his high school sweetheart, the mother of his child, the person he had built his entire adult life around. Brian, meanwhile, had been his closest friend for years, someone who knew every corner of Mike's life. For them, though, Mike was just an obstacle that needed to be removed so they could be together. The fact that their affair had fueled and justified such an elaborate crime spoke to the extent of their cold calculations. In his confession, Brian painted Denise as the driving force behind the plot. He claimed that she was the one who refused to consider divorce, the one who expressed concerns about the financial repercussions of separating. According to Brian, their relationship didn't just set the stage for the murder, it dictated it. Denise, he alleged, was the mastermind, the person who stood the most to gain from Mike's death. His testimony suggested that she had manipulated him into aiding in the crime, leveraging their affair to ensure his loyalty. But Brian's admission didn't settle everything. In exposing the details of the murder and implicating Denise, he also revealed the complexity of their relationship. Over time, the once convenient partnership between Denise and Brian began to crumble. The trust that had bound them during their plot unraveled, leaving room for paranoia and desperation to creep in. By the time Brian kidnapped Denise in 2016, their relationship had devolved into barely concealed hostility. His kidnapping attempt was, in part, an effort to keep Denise silent. He feared she might betray him, just as they had betrayed Mike. What he didn't realize was that his own actions would open the door to unravel everything. Brian's confession didn't just end years of speculation. It unmasked the full scope of a crime that had fooled investigators, friends, and family for nearly 2 decades. It revealed how two people had conspired to destroy a life and hide it behind a veil of normalcy. However, as the truth began to surface, so did questions about accountability. While Brian's role was now clear, Denise's part remained under scrutiny. If her involvement was as central as Brian claimed, why hadn't she faced consequences yet? And if she had orchestrated the plan, was justice finally closing in on her too? By this point, Denise's carefully constructed world had begun to collapse, but her legal fate was still to be determined. The courts now faced a critical decision: how to handle the woman whose life seemed built on lies, betrayal, and the ghost of the man she had once vowed to love. In May 2018, more than 17 years after Mike Williams vanished on what was initially thought to be a routine hunting trip, Denise Williams was arrested at Florida State University, where she worked. A grand jury had indicted her on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. The arrest came as a shock to many, but for investigators, it marked the culmination of years of mounting suspicion. Prosecutors accused Denise of masterminding the plot to kill her husband in order to be with Brian Winchester, her lover and longtime family friend. It wasn't just about their relationship, though. They pointed to the 1 million life insurance policy conveniently arranged by Brian himself as a key factor in Denise's alleged motivations. From the moment the charges became public, Denise's defense team emphatically denied her involvement. Her attorney, Ethan Way, was quick to assert that Denise had absolutely nothing to do with Mike Williams's disappearance and absolutely nothing to do with any of the crimes that Brian Winchester committed. He also criticized the timing of the indictment, noting that it followed Brian's incarceration for kidnapping Denise, an act that highlighted their fractured and volatile relationship. Nonetheless, prosecutors intended to make their case without hesitation, stating they would deny her bail and bring forward detailed evidence during trial. The case moved quickly. By late June 2018, Denise was ordered to remain in custody without bond, and a trial date was set for September of that year. Delays eventually pushed the trial to December, but when it finally began, both the prosecution and the defense faced the daunting task of disentangling nearly 2 decades of lies, cover-ups, and manipulation. For prosecutors, the heart of their case was Brian Winchester's testimony. As the state's star witness, Brian provided a damning first-hand account of the plot to kill Mike, painting Denise as the orchestrator. Brian took the stand and didn't hold back. He started by recounting his affair with Denise, which began in 1997, 3 years before Mike's disappearance. While both were still married to other people at the time, their relationship became more serious over time. According to Brian, the affair snowballed into something that couldn't be easily hidden or undone. He testified that the pair discussed various ways to be together, without dealing with the financial and social fallout of divorces. At one point, he said Denise had even suggested staging a boating accident on the Gulf of Mexico. Ultimately, though, they opted for a plan that involved a hunting trip, an activity Mike loved, and one that offered the perfect cover for an accident. In chilling detail, Brian described the events of December 16, 2000, the day he lured Mike to Lake Seminole with a promise of a routine duck hunting trip. Once on the water, Brian pushed Mike out of the boat, expecting him to drown quickly in the cold, murky lake while weighed down by his waders. But when Mike managed to stay afloat by clinging to a tree stump, Brian realized the plan wasn't going to work as smoothly as they'd intended. He took his shotgun and shot Mike in the face, ensuring his death. Afterward, Brian drove Mike's body to a predetermined location and buried him near Gardner Road in northern Leon County. The courtroom listened intently as Brian laid out not only the murder itself but also the conversations leading up to it. Conversations that, according to him, were driven by Denise. He portrayed her as the one who insisted they couldn't risk divorces and the one who pushed for Mike's death as the only solution. His testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, but it wasn't the only evidence they presented. Prosecutors introduced a recorded phone call between Kathy Thomas, Brian's ex-wife, and Denise. During the call, Kathy suggested she knew the truth about what had happened to Mike. Denise repeatedly tried to change the subject, but her apparent evasiveness raised more questions. At one point, she asked Kathy, "What do you know?" Prosecutors used this exchange to suggest that Denise was more than just an innocent party swept up in Brian's actions. Assistant State Attorney John Fuchs highlighted additional details to establish Denise's calculated role in the murder. He pointed out her calm, unemotional demeanor during key conversations about the crime, arguing that it reflected her cold-blooded involvement in planning her husband's death. The prosecution painted Denise as someone who had carefully balanced her image as a grieving widow while benefiting financially and personally from her husband's murder. The defense, led by Ethan Way, pushed back hard. Way argued there was no physical evidence directly tying Denise to the crime. He pointed out that the state had built its entire case around the testimony of a convicted felon, Brian Winchester, who had every incentive to shift blame onto someone else to save himself. Way expressed disbelief that Brian wasn't the one on trial, given that he had confessed to the murder. He framed Brian as an unreliable and self-serving witness whose plea deal had allowed him to avoid punishment for his actions. After 4 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 8 hours, carefully weighing the conflicting narratives put forth by the prosecution and the defense. In the end, the jury returned a verdict. Denise Williams was guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. For Cheryl Williams, who had fought tirelessly for justice for her son, the verdict was vindication after nearly 2 decades of waiting and wondering. During sentencing in February 2019, Cheryl addressed the court and spoke of the pain Denise had caused. She said Denise had not only taken her son, but had also taken her granddaughter, Ansley, by cutting Cheryl out of their lives in the years following Mike's death. Denise, for her part, remained silent during sentencing. The court handed down a life sentence with no possibility of parole, ensuring that Denise would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The conviction brought some semblance of closure to the tragedy, but it didn't end the ripple effects of what had happened. 5 months after her sentencing, new developments added another layer to the aftermath. Denise signed over all assets tied to Mike's estate and insurance payouts to their daughter, Ansley. In doing so, she avoided prosecution for insurance fraud deal that came with strict conditions. Ansley was prohibited from using the funds to support Denise's legal appeals. Should she violate the agreement, she risked a $150,000 penalty. This legal maneuver effectively cut Denise off from the financial gains she had once sought, redirecting them to the daughter she had been accused of betraying. Today, Denise Williams remains incarcerated at the Florida Women's Reception Center. Her case is a stark reminder of the lengths some people will go to for money and personal gain, and the devastating consequences those actions can have on the lives of others. For Cheryl, though, it was simple. Justice had finally been served. Denise's conviction confirmed what she'd suspected for years. While the legal system had been slow to act, it had ultimately fulfilled its role in holding the guilty accountable. Still, the lingering question for many is how Mike's death could have been disguised as an accident for so long, and how easily it could have stayed that way had it not been for years of unrelenting pressure from Cheryl to uncover the truth. At first glance, the disappearance of Mike Williams seemed straightforward, a hunter caught in the wrong place at the wrong time in Lake Seminole's treacherous waters. But what began as a presumed accident unraveled into a story of deception, greed, and murder, proving just how misleading appearances can be. This case reveals not only how easily justice can be delayed, but also what it takes to see it through to the end. Mike's story is a testament to the power of persistence and the consequences of assumptions made too early in an investigation. The initial investigation into Mike's disappearance was, by all accounts, flawed. From the moment his boat and truck were found, law enforcement narrowed their focus to a single theory: an accidental drowning. They didn't treat the boat as a potential crime scene. Instead, it was promptly returned to his family. The area around the boat ramp, heavily trampled by volunteers and searchers, was never secured as a possible site of foul play. These decisions limited early efforts to collect evidence. One officer later admitted, "We didn't have a whole lot to go on except there was an empty boat and the guy didn't show up." This approach, assuming the simplest explanation, meant critical details were overlooked. The mistakes didn't stop there. The alligator theory became a convenient explanation for why Mike's body wasn't recovered. But experts eventually debunked it, pointing out that cold December temperatures made it highly unlikely that alligators were active, let alone feeding. This shaky theory allowed investigators to dismiss growing doubts about the circumstances of Mike's disappearance. Instead of digging deeper, they clung to a narrative that was increasingly inconsistent with the evidence's lack of it. By prematurely closing the case as an accident, they allowed the truth to stay buried far longer than it should have. Cheryl Williams emerged as the pivotal force in keeping her son's story alive. Where investigators had faltered, she refused to give up. Cheryl's determination to challenge the initial findings transformed a closed case into an active search for justice. Over the years, she wrote more than 200 letters to Florida's governor, imploring authorities to reopen the investigation. She purchased newspaper ads, put up billboards, and engaged the community, ensuring no one forgot that Mike was still missing. Cheryl's actions weren't just about finding answers, they were about questioning the assumptions others had been too quick to accept. This maternal persistence wasn't without its challenges. Cheryl faced skepticism and pushback from her community, and even within law enforcement. Many criticized her for not letting it go, viewing her relentless focus as an inability to grieve and move forward. She admitted, "I get criticized a lot for not admitting that Mike's dead. All I know is I can't stop looking for him until I find him." Her refusal to accept anything less than the truth eventually forced authorities to take a second look. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement reopened the case in 2004, 4 years after it had been officially closed. While the investigation still moved slowly, her efforts had planted the seeds for what was to come. The role of financial motives in Mike's disappearance also illustrates a critical lesson about investigative thoroughness. Not long after Mike was declared dead, Denise Williams collected a $1 million life insurance payout. While this would have raised immediate suspicions in other cases, it didn't lead to further scrutiny at the time. Investigators overlooked the details of the policy, which had been arranged by Brian Winchester, Denise's close confidant and later her husband. Together, Denise and Brian had the means, motive, and opportunity to benefit from Mike's death, something that only became clear years later when the case was officially revisited. The financial aspect highlights just how complicated missing persons investigations can become when relationships and money are involved. Authorities initially treated Denise and Brian's relationship as coincidental, not conspiratorial. They married 5 years after Mike's disappearance, blending their lives seamlessly despite whispers of wrongdoing. To outsiders, it might have appeared like two people leaning on each other in the wake of shared tragedy. But when paired with the financial gain she received and Brian's eventual admissions, their marriage became a glaring red flag that should have been noticed sooner. The delay in considering these connections allowed years of secrecy to pass, prolonging the search for truth. Another systemic issue the case exposed was the failure to think beyond the idea of a routine accident. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which led the initial search, treated the case as a missing hunter incident from the start. While it's natural to assume the most straightforward explanation, doing so can lead investigators to overlook pivotal details. In Mike's case, this meant prematurely dismissing the possibility of foul play. Once the drowning theory took root, it framed every decision that followed. The search for evidence became an effort to confirm drowning, not to rule out alternative scenarios even, when the recovered items, from his perfectly intact waders to his floating flashlight, painted a conflicting picture. The broader implications of Mike Williams' case extend to how investigators handle missing persons cases overall. It highlights the importance of considering not only environmental factors but also human behavior. Financial records, personal relationships, and potential motives should have been explored far earlier. These elements often hold the key to unearthing the truth, especially in cases that seem to defy logic. Had investigators conducted a more thorough examination of Mike's life, his marriage, his friendships, and his finances, the cracks in the story might have appeared sooner. What's especially unsettling about this case is how close it came to remaining unsolved. Without Cheryl's pressure and Brian's eventual confession, Mike Williams likely would have been forever remembered as a victim of a tragic accident. His remains might never have been found, and the scheme to murder him might have succeeded without consequence. This reality underscores the need for persistence, both from law enforcement and from families, in pursuing justice. Cheryl's tireless advocacy serves as a reminder that one voice, even when ignored or dismissed, can make a difference in uncovering the truth. The Mike Williams case also acts as a warning about the power of unchecked assumptions. It's easy to believe the simplest narrative, especially in cases where evidence isn't immediately clear. But as this story demonstrates, the most obvious answer isn't always the correct one. For investigators, this means keeping an open mind, treating even seemingly routine disappearances with the care and thoroughness of a potential criminal case. For the public, it means resisting the urge to accept surface-level explanations that might let the true perpetrators slip away unnoticed. Ultimately, Mike's story reminds us that justice can be a long, difficult process. It stretches beyond the confines of an investigation and into the lives of those left behind. For Cheryl, that meant years of heartbreak and frustration, chasing a truth everyone else seemed willing to give up on. For investigators, it meant revisiting their early missteps and asking hard questions about what they'd missed. And for Denise and Brian, it meant the eventual unraveling of a web of lies they had spent years weaving. But the broader lesson is one of vigilance. Questioning inconsistencies, examining motives, and applying consistent pressure are all essential in the pursuit of justice. Whether it's the role of financial incentives, overlooked evidence, or the human desire to explain away tragedy, Mike's case shows that justice isn't always immediate, but it's always worth pursuing. In the end, the persistence of one determined mother proved stronger than the lies of two people who thought they had fooled everyone. As we reflect on this case, one lesson stands out: trust your instincts. Cheryl Williams refused to let go of the feeling that something was wrong, and her persistence changed everything. The truth may not have come easily, but it came. And sometimes, that's exactly what justice looks like. The story of Mike Williams is one of deception, betrayal, and a mother's unwavering fight for justice. Cheryl Williams' refusal to accept the explanations handed to her proved that persistence can uncover the truth, even when it feels impossible. Her advocacy forced authorities to re-examine a case that could have easily been forgotten. "I can't stop looking for him until I find him," she once said, a sentiment that defined her journey. This case is a reminder to question everything: the surface-level answers, the motives, and the trust we place in others. Justice isn't instant, but it's always worth pursuing.